The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows on the busy streets below. The rhythmic hum of city life filled the air. The steady flow of pedestrians, the rush of passing cars, the distant chatter of voices, all blending into a melody of normalcy. But on this day, something would shatter that melody, a moment so sharp and sudden that it would echo through the streets, leaving everyone who witnessed it unsure of what they had just seen. A black man walked down the sidewalk, his stride steady, his gaze unfocused, lost in thought. He was dressed simply, the kind of attire that blended effortlessly into the urban sprawl, the kind that didn't attract attention. For him, it was just another day. He was one of many in a sea of faces. He didn't expect to be noticed, but he would be. 2 patrol cars slid silently to a stop beside him, their tires hissing against the asphalt, drawing his eyes to them. The world seemed to slow, as if the street itself paused in anticipation. The doors of the cars opened with a deliberate force, the creak of metal breaking the silence. 2 figures in police uniforms stepped out, their movements too practiced, too mechanical. There was an air of authority about them, the kind that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen a badge. But there was something off, something unsettling. These weren't real cops. The men stood tall, their hands resting on their belts, as if the uniforms themselves were a shield against any threat that might come their way. Their eyes swept over the man before them, scanning, measuring. There was a predatory gleam in their expressions, a coldness that didn't belong on the faces of those sworn to protect. They knew it, and he felt it. "Hey, you!" one of them barked, his voice a razor-sharp command, cutting through the air. "Stop right there!" The man froze, a chill crawling up his spine. His instincts screamed that something was wrong, but he didn't move. He didn't speak. There was no reason to. Not yet. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, the weight of their eyes bore down on him, each word from their mouths sharp and deliberate. "ID," the second officer demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "Now." The man's stomach twisted as he reached for his wallet, but his mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary stop. These were no ordinary officers. They weren't here to help. They were here to cause trouble. He handed over his identification, but they didn't take it immediately. They lingered, studying it as if expecting to find something to justify their presence. As they inspected his papers, he could feel the weight of their gaze shift. It wasn't just about the ID, it was about him, his skin, the color of it. He was a target. They were already judging him before he'd even spoken. The subtle shift in their stance, the tightening of their jaws, the small, barely perceptible nods to each other, told him everything he needed to know. They were looking for something. "What's your business here?" one of them sneered, stepping closer now. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" The words were cutting, like knives. The man's chest tightened, but he stood tall. He wouldn't be intimidated. Not by them, but their presence was suffocating. And as the seconds stretched out, he knew this wasn't going to end well. The sun, once a warm companion, now felt distant, as if it had turned its back on him. The street, once bustling, now felt empty. Every passerby, suddenly a distant witness to something they didn't understand, something they didn't want to believe. The officers were testing him, prodding, pushing to see how far they could go before he snapped. And that's when the unexpected happened. One of the men, his eyes still locked on the ID, suddenly stiffened. There was a flicker in his gaze, an unmistakable recognition. His hand hesitated, then dropped to his side, fingers twitching. The other officer seemed to sense the change, turning sharply, his posture shifting into something more cautious. The air between them thickened, a momentary pause where the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Something was unfolding, something neither of them had anticipated. For a brief moment, the illusion of power they'd held over him faltered. They had been so sure, so confident. But now, doubt seeped into their actions. And in that split second, the man's past, one he had hoped was buried, began to rise from the shadows, like a ghost that could no longer be ignored. This was no ordinary encounter, and for them, it was already too late to turn back. The question came like a slap to the face. Who are you? It wasn't a question, really. It was a demand. The words were harsh, cutting through the air like a blade. The officer's eyes were fixed on him with cold intensity, as if trying to peel away his skin with nothing more than his stare. The man felt the weight of it, but he tried to remain calm. He had done nothing wrong. He had nothing to fear. Yet the hostility in their voices was palpable, like a thick fog hanging in the air. The officers weren't just asking questions. They were trying to break him. They were playing a game with him, one he didn't want to be a part of, but it was too late to back out now. "I asked you a question," the second officer barked, stepping closer. His breath reeked of stale coffee and anger. "Answer me." The man took a slow, steady breath. "I'm just walking home," he said, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But the officers didn't like that answer. Their faces twisted with contempt, the edges of their mouths curling into sneers. "You think you're just walking home?" The first officer scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Where's your ID again? What's your real name? What are you hiding?" The man clenched his jaw. He had given them his ID. He had nothing to hide, but they were digging deeper, looking for something to hold over him. They weren't going to stop, not until they humiliated him, until they had gotten what they wanted: control. "You don't belong here," the second officer said, his voice dripping with venom. "People like you shouldn't be walking around like you own the place." He said it like it was the gospel, a statement of truth, as if the man's very existence was an insult to the city. "People like me?" the man asked, his voice steady, but his mind racing. He knew what was coming. He had heard it before, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The officer's smirk widened, and he spat on the ground at the man's feet. "Yeah," he said, his words laced with disgust. "People like you who don't know their place." A knot formed in the man's stomach, but he swallowed it down. He had been through worse. He wouldn't let these strangers strip him of his dignity. Not now. Not in front of all these people who were pretending not to notice. The officers weren't done, though. They were just getting started. The first officer stepped forward, his chest puffed out as he leaned in. "You know," he said with a sneer, "I bet you've been arrested before, probably for something worse than what we're dealing with here." "I've never been arrested," the man replied, his voice tight but controlled. The officer's expression hardened. "I don't believe you," he spat. "You look like the type who would have been arrested, maybe for something more serious than what you want to admit." It wasn't just the words anymore. It was the tone, the attitude, the disdain. It wasn't about the man's past. It wasn't about his supposed crimes. It was about his skin, about his heritage, about his place in the world, a place these officers had decided he didn't deserve. The second officer sneered. "You're probably one of those criminals who's been getting away with things for years, huh? One of those guys who thinks the world owes him something just because he's black." He spat again, this time letting the saliva land closer to the man's shoe. The air between them crackled with the unspoken tension of racism, a weight the man had known all his life but never fully accepted. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface of every encounter, every interaction. But this time, it was different. This time, he could feel the heat of their hatred radiating from them, and he felt his blood start to boil. "Who the hell do you think you are?" the first officer shouted suddenly, stepping so close that the man could feel the heat of his body. "You think we're going to let you get away with this? You don't belong here, and you never will." The man's heart was pounding in his chest, but he refused to back down. "I belong here just as much as you do," he said quietly, his voice low but full of defiance. The officers exchanged looks, their eyes narrowing. They could see he wasn't going to break, not easily. So they upped the ante. "Maybe we should just take you in," the second officer suggested, as if the idea had just occurred to him. "Throw you in jail for a few hours, just to teach you some respect. You've probably got a record, right?" The man stood still, his breath slow but deliberate. He wouldn't be pushed into anger. He wouldn't give them what they wanted. But as he looked at the officers, he knew that they were getting more desperate. They weren't going to stop until they had completely dehumanized him. "You think this is funny?" the first officer said, leaning in even closer. "You think you can stand there, looking like you're untouchable, just because you've got that face?" The man's eyes hardened. "I'm not afraid of you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The officers didn't know how to respond because they hadn't expected this. They were used to men like him breaking, begging for mercy, or getting angry enough to give them an excuse to escalate things. But the man stood firm, his eyes locked on theirs with a strength they hadn't anticipated. In that moment, something in the officers' faces flickered. Doubt, maybe, or fear. They weren't sure what to do with a man who refused to be broken, who wasn't afraid to face them, even if they could crush him with a single word. The silence stretched. But just as quickly as it came, it was shattered by the sound of a distant siren. The officers' expressions shifted again, this time a mix of unease and frustration. They hadn't expected anyone else to show up, and the realization hit them like a punch. Their game with him was about to end, but not the way they wanted. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light, and these self-proclaimed authorities would regret everything they had done. The siren grew louder, its high-pitched wail cutting through the tension in the air, but it didn't matter. The two fake officers could feel their controls slipping. The man in front of them, his eyes cold, unwavering, defiantly unbroken, was more than they had bargained for. They hadn't anticipated him standing firm, refusing to cower before their tactics. They hadn't anticipated that he would remain calm, despite their best efforts to make him snap. The first officer looked nervously at the distant sound of the siren, then quickly turned back to the man. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched tight. The facade of confidence they had relied on now seemed thin, fragile. But the fear wasn't for themselves. It was for the power they thought they wielded, the control they believed they could impose. They had to regain that power. They had to keep him in his place. "You think you're untouchable, huh?" The second officer's voice was thick with disgust, a sneer curling his lips. He stepped forward again, trying to close the distance between them. "You're just another one of those criminals, aren't you? You probably think we won't do anything, that we're all bark and no bite." The man didn't flinch. He didn't back down. His posture was strong, unyielding. He knew these men weren't real officers. He knew they had no authority over him. But in that moment, they didn't need authority. They had something else. Fear. And fear was powerful. Fear could make people do unspeakable things. Fear could justify anything in their minds. Fear could erase any semblance of logic or morality. "You know," the first officer said with a slow, deliberate tone, his words dripping with venom. "People like you, people who look like you, don't belong here. You're just a statistic to us, another threat we need to control. We don't need your kind walking around like you're important. You're a liability, not a citizen." His words hit like a punch, each syllable aimed to wound, to hurt, to remind the man of the very thing he couldn't escape, the color of his skin. The man's chest tightened, but he held his ground. He refused to be broken by their words, even though they were meant to humiliate him, to reduce him to nothing but a stereotype they could handle, a caricature of the dangerous black man they had already decided he was. The second officer moved closer, his face twisted with a cruel smile. "You ever wonder why people like you are always on the wrong side of the law?" He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You're just part of the problem, a menace to society." The man felt the weight of the officer's words pressing on him, but he didn't react. He had been through this before, had heard it 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways. But it was never easier to hear, never easier to shoulder. Their words were weapons, and the longer they spoke, the more they tried to make him fit into the box they had already prepared for him. The box where every black man was a threat. The box where every black man was guilty until proven innocent. The box where every black man was less than human. They hadn't even bothered to listen to him. They hadn't given him a chance to explain who he was or what his life had been. To them, he was just another face in the crowd, just another body to control, to degrade, to break. "You're probably one of those guys who has no respect for the law, huh?" The first officer sneered, his eyes narrowing even more. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place, acting like you don't have to answer to anyone?" The man's eyes were locked onto theirs, and his voice, when he spoke, was calm but edged with resolve. "I don't have to answer to you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the officers seemed to pause. It wasn't the reaction they expected. They had pushed him, tested him, provoked him, just waiting for him to crack. But he hadn't. The silence lingered just a bit too long, making the officers uneasy. They had pushed him to the edge, and now they were waiting for him to fall. But instead, he stood tall. "You don't belong here," the second officer repeated, this time with more venom, as if repeating the lie enough would somehow make it true. He stepped even closer now, so close that the man could smell the sourness of his sweat, the sharpness of his breath. "We own this city, not you. You think anyone's going to listen to your side of the story? You think anyone cares about a criminal like you?" The man's breath caught in his throat for just a moment, but he didn't let himself be intimidated. He had spent his life trying to fight against these very stereotypes, against the assumption that because of his skin, he was guilty of something he hadn't even done, against the belief that he was inferior, dangerous, unworthy of respect. He had heard it all before, from the ignorant and the hateful. But this time was different. This time, he wouldn't let them define him. With a small but defiant tilt of his chin, he said, "You don't own me. You don't own this city. And I'll stand here all day if I have to, but I'm not the one who's wrong." For a moment, there was silence. The officers' expressions flickered. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected a black man to stand his ground, to defy them so completely. They had thought they could break him. They had thought that their power, their fake authority, would intimidate him. But it didn't. The first officer gritted his teeth, clearly frustrated. "You're making a mistake, buddy. A big one." He raised a hand as if to strike, but the second officer grabbed his wrist, pulling it down. The look in his eyes said it all. There was something shifting in the air, something neither of them could control. The man's calm, unwavering stance had thrown them off balance. Their fake authority was crumbling, their confidence shattering. They had pushed him to the limit, and he had not broken. He had not played into their hands. For the first time, they were the ones who felt small, but they weren't done. No, they would make him pay for defying them. They had already decided that this man, this black man, was a criminal, even before he had opened his mouth, and in their minds, they would make sure he paid for it. Let's take a short pause here. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with more. Now, let's continue. The air between them thickened, heavy with the unspoken tension. The two fake officers stood before him, their faces contorted in frustration, their words bouncing off the man's silence like stones against a wall. Every insult, every word aimed to provoke, seemed to dissipate into the nothingness of his unwavering stare. He said nothing. His lips remained sealed, and in that silence, he conveyed more than any speech ever could. "You think you're above us?" the first officer sneered, his voice rising. He stepped closer, trying to assert control, trying to force a reaction out of the man. "You're nothing but a piece of garbage, walking around like you own the place. Answer me, damn it!" Still, the man remained silent, his eyes locking with theirs, unwavering, as if his silence was a shield, as if he were refusing to play their game. The second officer was becoming visibly agitated. His hands twitched at his sides, as if he were ready to strike. "What's the matter with you? Do you not understand what's happening here? Do you think we're just playing games? You're nothing but a criminal in our eyes." He spat on the ground, barely missing the man's shoe. The words were nothing new. The venom behind them, however, was. He had heard it all his life, the words that tried to strip him of his dignity, to degrade him, to reduce him to a stereotype. But he wouldn't let them win. Not this time. The silence in the air grew heavier. It was deafening, and the officers, who had expected him to respond, expected him to either snap back or beg for mercy, were starting to crack under the weight of his refusal. The more they shouted, the more their anger grew, but it was as if they were shouting into an empty room, their voices swallowed up by the man's unyielding calm. "Why aren't you saying anything?" the first officer barked, his voice sharp, but there was a hint of uncertainty creeping in. "You think we're just going to let you walk away after everything you've done? You're a disgrace, and you know it." The second officer gritted his teeth, his hands curling into fists. "You don't get to stay silent when we're talking to you," he spat, stepping forward again. His eyes flickered with the briefest flicker of fear, but he quickly masked it with more anger. "You're nothing but a worthless thug, a criminal." The words stung, but the man refused to flinch. He simply stared at them, his gaze steady and unflinching. The officer's words bounced off of him, no longer able to penetrate his calm exterior. He wasn't going to let them drag him into their chaos, into their world of hate and fear. "Why don't you speak?" the first officer pressed, now nearly shaking with frustration. "What are you, too scared to talk? You think you're better than us because of the way you look?" His voice was now high-pitched, desperate for some form of acknowledgement, some form of reaction. "You think you can just stand there, silent, like you're some kind of king?" The second officer joined in, his voice laced with venom. "You're not in charge here. You're not the one who decides what happens next." He was so close now, his breath hot on the man's face. "You think you're special, don't you? Just because of your skin, just because of the way you walk? You think you deserve any respect at all?" The man's gaze never wavered. Every word, every insult, every accusation was meant to break him, to force him into a response that would confirm their worldview. They needed him to react, needed him to show weakness. It was all part of their game, part of the lie they had told themselves, that their power was real, that they could control others by breaking them down with words and fear. But in his silence, he had already won. Their anger was growing. Their frustration was turning into something else. Fear. They had expected him to crumble, to beg for mercy. Instead, they saw him stand tall, unfazed by their words. And that scared them more than anything. His silence was more powerful than any response he could have given. It was a refusal to engage in their twisted game, a declaration that he was not what they said he was, not the monster they needed him to be in order to justify their hatred. The first officer's face was now red with rage. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're a hero, huh?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can stand there and be all quiet like some noble figure? You're just like all the others, pretending you're above it all. You don't belong here." The silence stretched, and it became almost unbearable. The second officer took another step forward, his hands trembling. "Say something, damn it," he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "I'm tired of looking at your smug face like you're better than us. You're not better than anyone. You're nothing." And yet, the man said nothing. His silence was the loudest thing in that moment. It was deafening to the officers, who had no idea how to deal with it. They couldn't control it, couldn't manipulate it, and it was the one thing they feared most. The longer the man stayed silent, the more his power grew. Every second that passed made their words seem smaller, less significant. The truth was, they were the ones who were afraid. Afraid that their power, their authority, was nothing more than a fragile illusion that could be shattered by one simple truth. The man was not afraid of them. With every passing moment, the silence became a weapon, one they couldn't defend against. And it was in that silence, in the absence of words, that they knew they had lost. The man wasn't just standing there, he was defeating them with his silence. and there was nothing they could do about it. The air crackled with tension. The silence that had previously felt like a weapon now seemed to suffocate the space between them. The two fake officers exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Their frustration was palpable, but something else had begun to flicker in their eyes. A sense of unease they couldn't quite shake off. What had started as an easy target was now something far more complicated. They were no longer just dealing with a random man on the street. The first officer shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man before him. Something was off. He had seen it in the way the man stood, still, unwavering, but there was more to it now. The way he looked at them, so calmly, without any fear or submission, was starting to feel wrong. They had expected him to crumble, to cower under the weight of their accusations. But instead, the man stood tall, resolute, like someone who had seen it all before. "Who the hell are you, really?" the second officer muttered under his breath, though loud enough for the first officer to hear. His voice now had a slight tremor, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. They weren't dealing with a simple civilian, that much was clear. The first officer caught the slight hesitation in his partner's voice and glanced back at the man. Something about him felt different now. The confidence that had initially burned bright was dimming into doubt. Was this really just another random black man on the street? Someone they could intimidate and control? Or was there more to this story than they had bargained for? "Check his ID again," the first officer snapped, the command coming out a little sharper than he had intended. The second officer obeyed, though his hands were trembling slightly as he took the man's identification again. He scrutinized it more carefully, as though expecting to find something he had missed the first time. The seconds stretched into minutes. The longer they looked at the ID, the more uncomfortable the officers became. Something wasn't right. "Who the hell are you, really?" the first officer demanded again, his voice growing more aggressive. "This isn't just some random guy. What are you hiding?" The man didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on theirs, but something flickered behind them. The officers were now digging deeper, and they didn't know just how deep the hole was they were about to fall into. The second officer's fingers hovered over the man's ID, his mind racing. He could feel the heat of his partner's gaze on him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the small details that now seemed so glaringly obvious. The address on the ID, the name, the place of birth. There was something in the details that made him pause. Something too clean, too precise. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind, one that made his stomach drop. "This name," he muttered to himself, scanning the ID one more time. "This guy. He's not just some nobody, is he?" The first officer looked over his shoulder, the unease now turning into suspicion. "What are you talking about?" The second officer hesitated, but the words were already out. "I think this guy, this name, it looks too familiar. We might be dealing with someone big here." The first officer stared at him, confusion turning to realization. "You don't mean—" The second officer nodded, his mind running through the list of faces, names, and past incidents. "He's not just some guy. We've seen his name come up in reports before, but I didn't think it was him. But it is." He paused, his voice growing colder. "This man, he was one of the top informants in the department's investigations years ago. He worked directly with officers, real officers, people who actually mattered. He's been involved in some high-profile cases, big cases." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes briefly shifted. They locked onto the second officer's for a moment. The recognition in the officer's face was enough to confirm what he had suspected all along. "You," the first officer muttered, stepping closer, as if trying to make sense of it all. "You're not just some random guy." His voice dropped to a low, almost dangerous whisper. "You're not who we thought you were, are you?" The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was confirmation enough. The realization hit the officers like a slap in the face. This was no ordinary man. He had been involved in some of the most sensitive operations. And now here he was, standing in front of them, silent as ever, with every intention of making them realize just how far they had overstepped. The second officer took a step back, his hand reaching for his radio, his voice cracking. "We need backup. We need to get this guy out of here now." But the first officer was already shaking his head. "No, we don't. We handle this ourselves." There was a moment of silence. The realization of their situation was settling in. They had no idea who they were truly dealing with. They had tried to degrade him, to put him in his place, but they had only managed to dig themselves deeper into a hole they couldn't climb out of. The man's gaze never left them. He knew they had realized their mistake, but it was too late now. They had crossed the line, and no matter how much they tried to dig into his past, no matter how hard they tried to create a narrative that suited their need to control him, he wasn't going to let them win. In that moment, the system that they believed they could manipulate had turned against them. The man before them wasn't just a victim of their abuse. He was a reminder of the truth they had tried to ignore. Not everyone could be controlled. And the officers realized, too late, that they had underestimated him. The very system they thought they had in their favor had now become their enemy, and they were about to pay the price for their arrogance. The weight of the silence pressed heavily upon the scene, like a storm waiting to burst. The two fake officers, now on edge, exchanged nervous glances as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. The realization of who they were dealing with had begun to sink in, but it wasn't enough to stop them. In fact, their desperation only grew. They had to make this man break, to force him into their narrative, but that wasn't happening. The man remained as silent and unmoving as a stone. Frustration built inside them, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. They had underestimated him. They had thought him to be a random, defenseless black man, someone they could intimidate and control with nothing more than their badges and their racial hatred. But now, as the truth began to emerge, they were beginning to understand that they had made a critical mistake. "I don't give a damn about your silence anymore," spat the first officer, his voice laced with anger. "You're just a criminal, and we're going to find out who you really are. The real you." The second officer was still examining the man's identification, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through the information on the screen. It wasn't like him to make mistakes. He had been a cop long enough to recognize every detail, to follow the patterns. But something about this man's ID, something about the history behind it, just didn't add up. He was getting impatient, ready to be done with the situation. But as his eyes scanned the data again, something jumped out at him. He froze. His heart skipped a beat. "Wait a minute," he muttered, more to himself than to his partner. This can't be right." The first officer leaned in, his anger momentarily forgotten. "What is it? What did you find?" The second officer didn't immediately respond. His mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of information in front of him. The name, the address, the dates. Everything seemed ordinary at first glance, but as he dug deeper into the records, he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. It was there, hidden among the routine data. A list of past cases, an investigation that linked the man to high-profile law enforcement operations. He wasn't just anyone. He wasn't just some random person they could humiliate. This man had been involved in critical top-level cases. The man standing before them was no stranger to the real system of justice. The second officer's breath caught in his throat. He turned the screen toward his partner. This guy, he's not just some nobody. He's an ex-cop, a former veteran of the force. The first officer's face went pale. He couldn't believe it. The man before him, the man he had been trying to break with his insults, the man he had treated as inferior, a target of his racial hatred, was once part of the very system he had been trying to degrade. He had tried to tear him down, to humiliate him, and yet he had no idea who he was truly dealing with. "Former cop?" the first officer repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. The second officer nodded slowly, his fingers scrolling further down the screen. "Yeah, he's got a whole history in law enforcement, fighting crime, working undercover. He's been involved in some of the most important cases we've had. And now, we're here, treating him like he's some street thug." The realization hit them both like a ton of bricks. The man before them wasn't just a random black man. He wasn't someone they could intimidate into submission with their racist words. He had been part of a system they couldn't even begin to understand. A system that they had tried to twist into their own vision of control and power. He knew the system better than they did. The first officer stumbled back, his mouth hanging open. This can't be happening, he muttered, as the implications of their mistake began to hit him full force. They had thought they could humiliate him, break him down with their words, treat him like a criminal simply because of his race. They had ignored his humanity, his history, his connection to the very system they had tried to claim ownership of. And now they were facing the undeniable truth. They had been wrong. The man's past wasn't just something they could erase with a few choice insults. It wasn't something that could be ignored. His history tied him directly to the law enforcement system they had spent the past few minutes attempting to disgrace. He had seen the corruption, the abuse, the power struggles up close, and he had fought against them. As the officers struggled to comprehend the depth of their mistake, the man's calm, unwavering presence seemed even more imposing. The silence that had once been a weapon now felt like a heavy judgment, one that they couldn't escape. "You," the first officer began, his voice shaking, but the words failed him. He couldn't find the right ones to express his fear, his shame. The power had shifted. The system they had tried to manipulate had turned on them, and now they were the ones who felt small. The second officer, still staring at the screen, couldn't tear his eyes away. The truth was undeniable. This man was no common criminal. This man was someone who had dedicated his life to law and order, someone who had worked from within to fight the very type of corruption and racism that they had just tried to unleash upon him. They had underestimated him in the worst way possible, and in doing so, they had revealed their own ignorance, their own deep-seated hatred, and their inability to see beyond their own prejudices. The silence between them grew heavier. There was nothing they could say now that would undo the damage they had caused. Nothing they could do to reverse the twisted game they had tried to play. But in that silence, the truth was loud and clear. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was a revelation. And for the officers, it was the beginning of the end. The man stood before them, calm, unyielding, as they grappled with the consequences of their actions. The moment of realization hit the officers like a bolt of lightning, the weight of it crashing down on them with the force of an avalanche. Their eyes widened as the truth settled in, a cold chill running down their spines. They had thought they were dealing with just another black man, a target they could humiliate, break, and control with their lies and their badge. But now, the truth was undeniable. This was not just some random passerby. The silence that had lingered between them for so long suddenly felt suffocating. The air was thick with panic, and the officers could feel the walls closing in. The man was no longer just a threat they could easily dismiss. His past, his connections, his experience, it all meant something. They had overplayed their hand, and now they were trapped in a web of their own making. The first officer's hands began to tremble. The pride, the arrogance that had driven them to humiliate this man so mercilessly began to crumble. The realization of their mistake weighed heavily on him. But there was something even worse creeping in. The fear of the consequences. They weren't just dealing with some minor infraction anymore. This was far bigger than they had anticipated. If word got out about their actions, it could destroy their careers, their reputations, their lives. The scandal would be enormous. "What the hell do we do now?" the second officer whispered, his voice cracking. He could barely meet the man's eyes anymore. His grip on his radio tightened, but the realization that they had no control over the situation made him feel utterly powerless. He was terrified. They both were. The first officer's thoughts raced. They couldn't just walk away. They couldn't just let this go. But every instinct told him that they had crossed a line that would cost them dearly. He could feel the blood drain from his face as he thought about the possibility of facing charges. Maybe even criminal charges. They had assumed they were above reproach, but now they understood how far from the truth that had been. "Listen," the first officer began, his voice shaky, but he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. What was there to say? They were caught, and they knew it. The man before them watched it all unfold with cold, unwavering eyes. He understood exactly what was happening. He could see the panic in their faces, the desperation that began to show as the officers realized the full scope of their mistake. His silence was powerful now, more than ever. It was a calm, controlled force that made them feel small, trapped in their own lies. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The first officer spat, but it was no longer a command, no longer an accusation. It was fear, pure and raw. His facade was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to hold it together. The power that had once been his, simply because of his badge, was fading away as the truth took hold. The second officer, looking at the first officer, finally let out a breath, his shoulders slumping. "We need to leave. Now," he muttered, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and terror. It was the only thought that made sense to him. If they stayed any longer, if they tried to push this further, they were going to end up in a much worse situation than they could ever imagine. But the first officer, still clinging to the false sense of control, snapped, "We can't just walk away. We need to make him—" The second officer cut him off, his voice desperate. "No, we need to get out of here before we make it worse." The tension was unbearable. The officers glanced at each other, the weight of their situation sinking in. They had tried to break him, humiliate him, degrade him. They had believed they were untouchable, that they could twist the truth however they saw fit. But the man had refused to be their victim, and now they were left with nothing but the realization that their actions had spiraled out of control. As the first officer's face turned a shade paler, his grip tightening on his baton, he knew they were seconds away from making the worst decision of their lives. They couldn't keep pushing this. They couldn't risk taking this any further. Panic gripped him like a vice. The man saw it all. He saw how the officers' nervous glances grew more frantic, how their once confident postures collapsed into something weak, desperate. He understood that the tables had turned. He had no intention of letting them off the hook, but he also knew that in the end they had already lost. Their power was gone. And so, in that moment, as they started to back away, his eyes narrowed. His gaze was no longer passive. It was hard, unwavering, filled with an unspoken promise. "You're not getting away this easy," he said, his voice low but firm. There was no fear in his tone, only finality. The officers froze, caught off guard. For the first time, they realized just how much trouble they were in. They weren't just dealing with a man they could intimidate. They were dealing with someone who knew the system better than they did. Someone who had been a part of the very system they had tried to corrupt and control. He wasn't going to let them slink away and escape the consequences. The realization hit them hard. The panic in their eyes was clear now. They had gone too far. There was no easy way out of this. As they tried to retreat, stumbling over their own fear, the man stood his ground, a figure of calm strength, knowing full well that whatever happened next, they would never be able to walk away from this encounter unscathed. The system had turned on them, and there would be no escaping the fallout. As the man stood there, his gaze unwavering, he felt the tension in the air shift. The officers' fear was palpable, their desperation evident as they stumbled over their words. But there was something else in the way they reacted. A subtle but undeniable hint that their actions were part of something much larger, something more insidious than just a random act of racism. It wasn't just about him. It never had been. Their desire to humiliate him, to break him down, was rooted in something deeper, something that went beyond personal vendettas or the simple thrill of exerting power over a black man. He had spent years fighting against the system that had tried to control him, tried to label him, to trap him in a box built on stereotypes. But now, as the pieces of this encounter began to fit together, a chilling realization washed over him. These officers, their anger, their cruelty, their need to degrade him, it was a small part of something much larger. The whole system was rigged, using racism as a weapon to destroy lives, to manipulate people, to mask its own ugliness. The officers weren't just small-time racists, they were part of a machine, a system designed to perpetuate oppression and violence. And they weren't acting alone. This wasn't just a personal attack, it was a tactic, a small cog in a larger network of corruption. They had been used, manipulated, to carry out a much bigger agenda, one that wasn't about just getting rid of him, but about sending a message to anyone who dared challenge the status quo. "You're not just a victim of my words, are you?" the man said, his voice low but resolute. His eyes bored into theirs, and for a brief moment they both faltered. The realization was sinking in, but neither of them could escape it. The first officer, his face pale, tried to collect himself, but there was no denying the panic in his eyes. He could feel the shift in the air, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, though he knew the answer. "I know you're kind," the man continued, stepping closer. "You don't do this just because you hate someone like me. You do it because you've been told to. You've been trained to. The system is telling you to break people like me, to humiliate them, to make them feel small. You're not just some ignorant cop on a power trip. You're part of something bigger, a network of lies, oppression, and fear." The second officer visibly flinched at the words. The truth was unraveling before him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The man was right. The officers weren't acting independently. Their actions were part of a much larger conspiracy, a way to maintain control, to uphold a system that thrived on racism, violence, and the destruction of anyone who threatened the status quo. The man knew that his humiliation wasn't just an isolated event. The officers had been used, like pawns in a game they didn't even understand. Their racism wasn't just a product of ignorance, it was a tool, a weapon, used to further a greater agenda. And it was so deeply ingrained in their training, in their identities, that they didn't even recognize it for what it was. "Your badges aren't just symbols of power," the man said, his voice growing colder. "They're symbols of control. You're not protecting anything. You're enforcing a system that uses people like me as scapegoats, as targets to distract from its real crimes." The officers stood there, speechless for a moment, their minds racing. They had thought they were simply enforcing the law, doing their jobs, but now everything had changed. The weight of their actions was no longer just about their own personal biases. It was about something far darker, far more dangerous. The first officer looked at his partner, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" he whispered. The second officer's hands were shaking, his mind trying to make sense of what he had just heard. He couldn't deny it anymore. The man was right. The truth had always been there, hidden in plain sight. The system had used them, used their hate, used their racism to perpetuate its own agenda, its own violence. And now they were left to face the consequences. But the man wasn't done. He could see the wheels turning in their heads, the guilt, the fear, and the shame. He knew they couldn't escape it now. The truth had been revealed, and they couldn't pretend it didn't exist. "You're just cogs in the machine," the man continued, his voice cold and cutting. "You think you're above it all. You think you have the power, but you don't. You're just instruments of a system that will throw you away once you've outlived your usefulness. People like you, ignorant, racist, hateful, are the ones who keep it all going, and you're too blinded by your own prejudices to see that you're just pawns in a game." The officers stood motionless, as if the ground beneath them had shifted. Their faces were pale, their minds reeling from the weight of the words that had been spoken. They had never considered themselves to be part of something this dark. They had always believed they were above it, that their actions were justified by their badges, by the law. But now, that illusion was shattered. The man didn't wait for them to respond. He knew they didn't have the words. They had never been taught to question the system. They had been trained to follow orders, to see people like him as nothing more than criminals to be crushed underfoot. But now they were seeing the truth, and it was too late to undo the damage. As the officers stood there, frozen, the man stepped back, his gaze unwavering. You may think you're in control, but you're not, he said softly. The system is what controls you. And the sooner you realize that, the sooner you'll understand how powerless you really are. He turned and began to walk away, leaving the officers standing in the midst of their unraveling world. They were trapped now, their own actions, their own ignorance, the system that had trained them, all closing in around them. And for the first time, they understood. They were just another part of the machine, one that had been built on oppression, racism, and lies. And no matter how much they tried to escape it, it would always come back to them. The tension in the air was thick, oppressive, as the two officers stood frozen, facing the man. They were slowly retreating, the sense of victory slipping through their fingers. But their retreat wasn't fast enough. The man, silent and still, knew he couldn't let this moment pass without consequences. He had already seen the fear in their eyes, the way they were slowly realizing that they were caught, trapped in a game that they could no longer control. They were already planning their exit, their desperate attempt to flee from the situation. They wanted to get away from the man, to leave the scene, hoping that somehow they could erase the mistake they had made. But the man wasn't going to let them, not this time. As they began to turn, thinking they had gotten away with something, the man's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp, like a knife. "I remember your faces," he said quietly, but his words were laden with a promise that made their blood run cold. "And soon, you'll be in my place. You'll be the ones who are looked at, judged, treated as criminals, just like you tried to do to me. You won't get away from this." The words hit them like a slap, making them freeze in their tracks. The officers glanced at each other, their eyes wide with shock, suddenly realizing that this was far from over. This wasn't just a man they had tried to break. It was someone who had a far deeper understanding of justice than they had ever considered. "You think you can just walk away, don't you?" The man continued, his voice growing firmer. "You think that just because you have a badge, you can ruin lives without facing any consequences. But let me make this clear, you're not getting away with it." The officers felt the weight of those words pressing down on them. And for the first time, they realized the man wasn't just talking about retribution. It wasn't just about getting back at them for what they had done. No, his vision of justice went far beyond anything they could comprehend. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without repercussions, and the fear they had seen in his eyes earlier was now fully realized in their own. The first officer, who had been so sure of himself moments before, now felt the crushing weight of guilt. His knees felt weak, and his grip on his baton tightened. But the resolve that had once driven him now seemed like a distant memory. They had thought they were above it all, that their actions, fueled by their power and the badge they wore, would go unchecked. But they were wrong. They had miscalculated. The second officer stood there, his face pale as he stared at the man, unable to speak. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to escape the consequences that were surely coming. But he knew, deep down, that there was no running from what they had done. "You think you can hide behind your badge, behind your uniforms?" the man continued, stepping closer, his voice calm but filled with an unsettling certainty. "But you're nothing more than puppets, and the system you've worked for is starting to tear itself apart. You think you've won today, but you're wrong. It's going to be you who will pay the price for this." The officers flinched at the man's words. They had tried to degrade him, to push him into a corner, to make him submit to their power, but they were the ones who had been trapped. And now, as they stood there in their uniforms, with the realization of what they had done slowly sinking in, they knew they were no longer in control. The man wasn't just any random person on the street. He wasn't just someone they could humiliate and forget about. He was someone whose understanding of justice far surpassed anything they had ever been taught, and it was clear to them now that they had underestimated him in the worst way possible. "You're going to be remembered," the man said coldly, his words like ice. "And when everything comes to light, when the truth about what you've done here is exposed, you will see how quickly everything you've ever known will crumble around you." The officers were silent now, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They had thought they were in control, that they could manipulate the situation, bend the truth to fit their needs. But they were facing someone who had a much more profound grasp on justice. Someone who understood that power wasn't just about what you wore on your uniform. It was about the impact you left behind, the way you treated others, and how far you were willing to go to make things right. They stood there, paralyzed, as the man's words settled in their minds, like a weight they couldn't escape from. There was no way out. They had crossed a line, and now they would face the consequences. The man's calm, unwavering resolve was all that stood between them and the truth they had tried to hide from. "You've crossed the line," the man said, his tone now final, like the last stroke of a judge's gavel. "And now you'll face the music." And with that, he turned and began to walk away, leaving the officers standing there, frozen in place, their hearts racing with the realization that the game was over. The consequences were coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop them. The truth had crashed down on them, and there was no escaping it now. The officers stood there, frozen in place, their bodies shaking with a mixture of fear and shame. They could feel the weight of their actions pressing down on them, the crushing realization that everything they thought they knew about power and control had just unraveled. They had tried to break him, to humiliate him, to reduce him to a mere object of their twisted authority. But they had failed. Their arrogance, their belief that they were untouchable, had been shattered by a man who refused to bow down to their fake authority. A man who, despite the abuse and degradation, had stood tall, unwavering, a beacon of strength that they couldn't break. And now, as they turned to leave, they could feel the heavy truth of what had just happened weighing on their shoulders. But before they could walk away, they stopped. They both turned to look at the man one last time. This time, there was no anger in their eyes, no hatred, no desire to humiliate. There was something else, something that neither of them had expected to feel. There was respect. They had thought they were the ones in control. They had thought they could walk away from this encounter without consequences, that their badges and their power would shield them from the truth. But now they understood. The real power wasn't in their fake uniforms or the weapons they carried. The real power was in the man standing before them. His strength wasn't in the badge he wore or the force he could use, but in his spirit. His refusal to let them break him was a testament to something far greater than the shallow authority they had clung to. The first officer looked at his partner, his face pale and filled with regret. "He wasn't just a random guy," he whispered. "He's something more, something we'll never understand." The second officer couldn't answer. His eyes were still locked on the man, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man had been so calm, so composed, even when they were at their worst. He had seen through their facade, had known exactly what they were doing, and still, he hadn't flinched. They had tried to break him with their words, their racism, their brutality. They had tried to tear him down and humiliate him in front of everyone. But he had held his ground, and in doing so, he had shown them something they would never forget. His freedom wasn't something that could be taken from him. It wasn't something they could control or erase with their hate and prejudice. His freedom was in his refusal to be broken. His strength was in his spirit, in his refusal to be anything less than who he was. The officers turned away, but they didn't feel victorious. They didn't feel that sense of power they had once held so tightly to. Instead, they felt something else. A hollow emptiness, a quiet shame. They had tried to destroy someone, and in the process, they had destroyed a part of themselves. The power they had once believed in was exposed for what it truly was: fake, hollow, and ultimately meaningless in the face of true strength. The man watched them go, his expression unreadable, but there was a quiet resolve in his eyes. He knew that this wasn't over. The battle for justice wasn't won in one moment, one confrontation. But in this moment, he had shown them the one truth that mattered. True power comes from within, from the strength of the spirit, from the refusal to be controlled by those who seek to oppress. He had fought, not with fists or violence, but with something much more enduring, his dignity, his will, and his unbreakable sense of self. And in doing so, he had shown these officers what real strength looked like. The story was over, but the lessons would stay with them, and with him, for the rest of their lives. And as they walked away, the officers understood that no matter how many badges they wore, no matter how many lies they told themselves, true freedom could never be taken by force. It could only be earned through the fight for what was right, the fight for justice, and the fight to hold on to your humanity in a world that constantly tries to strip it away. And for the man, the fight was far from over. It was just beginning.